How can you trust a book when all the original pages are lost? That's the central question when we talk about the Bible. We don't have the original documents written by the original authors, so how in the world do we know the copies we have today are even close to accurate? Well, today we're going to dive into the evidence behind one of history's most influential texts.
This right here is the core challenge. I mean, think about it. If we're working with copies of copies of copies, how much confidence can we really have in what we're reading today? It sounds like a giant game of telephone, right? Well, that's the historical mystery we're going to unravel.
So, let's just get this out of the way right up front. Not a single original page, what scholars call an autograph, has survived to this day. Not one. Every manuscript we have is a copy. But far from being a dead end, this is actually where our historical detective story begins, and it's a story of incredible preservation and amazing discovery.
Okay, let's start with the Old Testament. The case for its reliability doesn't rest on finding some dusty, ancient original scroll. Nope, it rests on the unbelievably meticulous, almost obsessive process used to copy it for centuries.
So, let's meet the heroes of this part of the story, a group of Jewish scribes called the Masoretes. Now, these guys weren't just copyists, they saw themselves as textual guardians. They established a set of fiercely strict rules to make sure that every new copy was a perfect, and I mean perfect, replica of the old one. Their dedication to accuracy was nothing short of legendary.
Look at this number, 42,377. What in the world is that? Well, that's the number of times the Hebrew letter Aleph appears in the Old Testament. The Masoretes didn't guess this. They literally counted it, along with every other letter. If a scribe finished a new copy and the letter count was off by even one, the entire manuscript was considered corrupt and had to be destroyed. That's the fanatical level of precision we're talking about here.
You see, their process wasn't just a job, it was a sacred duty. They counted every single letter. They knew the exact middle letter of entire books like Genesis or Isaiah. They had strict rules for the kind of parchment, the color of the ink, even the number of lines on a page. And get this, if a potential error was found in an older manuscript they were copying from, they would never change the main text. Instead, they'd add a little note in the margin. It was a system engineered for perfect transmission.
For centuries, this amazing story of scribal care was all that scholars had to go on. It was a compelling story, sure, but it was still just a story. There was no way to prove it. Then, in the middle of the 20th century, a completely accidental discovery in a desert cave changed everything.
This timeline really shows you the massive leap we're talking about. Before the Dead Sea Scrolls were found, our oldest complete Hebrew manuscripts came from around 900 AD. These scrolls, they suddenly gave us text from 1,000 years earlier. This was it. It was the ultimate test of that meticulous scribal tradition.
I mean, can you imagine? Found by a shepherd boy in these caves near the Dead Sea, this incredible treasure trove had fragments from every single book of the Old Testament except for one, and, most amazingly, a complete, intact scroll of the book of Isaiah. So the question was, had the text changed over 1,000 years of copying?
The result was absolutely stunning. When scholars carefully compared the ancient Isaiah scroll from the Dead Sea with the Masoretic text from 1,000 years later, they were virtually identical. The differences were incredibly minor, things like spelling variations. This was it. Dramatic physical proof that the scribal process had actually worked. It was an astonishing confirmation. Okay, so that's the Old Testament, a story of careful, controlled, almost perfect preservation. The New Testament, though, it's a completely different picture. Its reliability is confirmed not by a single narrow stream of transmission, but by an absolute flood of manuscript evidence.
The key phrase here is formidable witness. Instead of just a few meticulously preserved copies, for the New Testament, we have thousands and thousands of manuscripts from different times, different places, and even different languages. This sheer volume allows scholars to compare, contrast, and cross-reference the text in an incredibly powerful way.
This flood of evidence basically flows in four main streams. You've got the earliest fragments, written on papyrus, two different styles of Greek manuscripts called uncials and minuscules, and thousands of early translations into other languages like Latin, Syriac, and Coptic.
So, you may hear these terms, uncials and minuscules, and wonder what the difference is. Well, it's pretty simple. It's all about the script. Uncials are the older, more formal manuscripts written entirely in capital letters. Think of it like typing with the caps lock on. Minuscules came later, and they use a faster, lowercase cursive script, which is why so many more of them exist.
The sheer scale of this
manuscript flood is just staggering. We have fragments on papyrus that date back to the 3rd century. We have about 240 major uncial manuscripts, these beautiful all-caps texts like the famous Codex Sinaiticus. On top of that, there are nearly 3,000 of the later minuscule manuscripts, plus thousands of copies of early translations. The wealth of data is just immense. So, we have the story of meticulous preservation for the Old Testament and an absolute flood of evidence for the New. How do scholars put it all together to actually reach a verdict? Well, this is where the science of textual analysis comes into play. This scientific field is called textual criticism, and really it's like historical detective work. By comparing thousands of manuscripts from all these different geographical regions and time periods, scholars can spot the rare copyist errors like a misspelled word or skipped line and confidently reconstruct what the original text almost certainly said. And the verdict from this science is remarkably clear. While some people might see the hand of God in its preservation, from a purely historical and scientific standpoint, the conclusion is that the biblical text has been substantially preserved. The core message, the core narratives, they've all come through the centuries intact. And you know, that brings us to our final question. We've journeyed through the incredible story of the text itself, the scribes, the scrolls, and the science. We've seen the powerful evidence for its remarkable stability over millennia. So the question that leaves us with is this: if the words of the text are this historically reliable and stable, what might that imply about the message they carry? Now that is something to think about. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer.